Every haunting has a beginning. This one began with a sound. An ordinary knock inside an ordinary home. Except it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the wall. The first person to hear it was 11-year-old Janet Hodgson. But for the moment, the house is quiet again. This is 284 Green Street, a small council house in Enfield, North London, where Peggy Hodgson was raising 4 children on her own. It was crowded, the walls were thin, the floorboards carried every footstep from one room to another. In this house, strange sounds usually had very ordinary explanations. On the night of the 30th of August, 1977, Janet and her older sister Margaret were sent upstairs to bed. Nothing about the room felt unusual. Their clothes were where they had left them. The chest of drawers stood against the wall. Their younger brothers were close by. Everything was as it should be. Then, Janet felt the mattress move beneath her. Not a violent jolt. Not enough to throw her from the bed. Just movement. She called to Margaret. Margaret had felt it too. The girls did what children do when something frightens them. They called for their mother. Peggy started upstairs expecting an argument, a joke, or any other reason the girls had invented to avoid going to bed. By the time she reached the bedroom, the movement had stopped. She checked the beds. Nothing. She looked around the room. Nothing had fallen. Nothing appeared disturbed. The simplest explanation was still the most likely one. 2 children were overtired and winding each other up. Peggy told them to settle down and returned downstairs. For the rest of that night, the house gave her no reason to be concerned. But the following evening, the children called again. This time, Peggy did not hurry. She had already inspected the room once. She had already found nothing. As she crossed the hallway and placed a foot on the stairs, she expected to repeat the same conversation. Then a sound came from above her. A low scrape. Heavy enough to be furniture. Peggy stopped halfway up. The sound stopped too. She continued toward the landing. It began again. Not from the children, but from inside their bedroom. Peggy approached the closed door. The children were speaking over one another now, insisting that something in the room was moving. She pushed the door open. The chest of drawers was no longer against the wall. It had shifted towards the doorway. Peggy crossed the room and pushed it back into place. There was an ordinary explanation. Uneven floorboards. Old furniture. The girls had moved it. So she pressed the chest firmly against the wall and watched the children. And according to Peggy's later account, the furniture pressed back. For a second, she felt resistance through both hands, as though someone on the other side were pushing the drawers back towards her. Then it stopped. Peggy released the chest and turned to the girls. Behind her, wood scraped across the floor. The chest had moved towards the door again. Until that moment, Peggy had been trying to discover what the children were doing. Now she was standing between them and the only exit. She ordered everyone out of the room. The children moved onto the landing. Peggy followed and pulled the bedroom door closed. At first, that helped. The wall separated them from whatever had happened inside. Then, 4 knocks sounded from the other side. Slow, evenly spaced, and close enough that nobody on the landing needed to ask where they had come from. Peggy opened the door again. The bedroom was empty. The chest of drawers stood away from the wall, but nothing else had changed. No intruder. No open window. No place for someone to hide. Peggy began searching the house. She checked the window catches. She looked beneath the beds. She pressed her ear to the wall, listening for neighbours on the other side. But the knocks didn't remain in one place. 1 minute they came from the bedroom wall, then the ceiling, then somewhere farther along the landing. Each time Peggy moved towards them, they seemed to move away. The children watched their mother search the rooms. Until now, Janet had just needed Peggy to believe her. But Peggy was no longer looking at Janet. She was looking at the house. Still, she refused the explanation that frightened her most. She tried to convince herself that a person was making the noise, trying to scare them. She needed to get help. So she gathered the children, led them through the front door, and crossed Green Street to the Nottingham's house. Her neighbour, Vic Nottingham, returned with her. Vic entered number 284 expecting loose pipes. A neighbour's television, perhaps, or an animal trapped beneath the floor. Peggy showed him the bedroom first. He checked the walls. He moved through the landing and into the other rooms. He searched outside. Nothing. Then the knocking began while he was still inside. Vic followed it from one wall to another. But every time he reached the place where the sound seemed strongest, it came from somewhere else. The family had found another witness, but still had no explanation. Shortly before midnight, Peggy called the police. 2 officers arrived expecting a domestic disturbance. They had no reason to assume anything else. They had no reason to turn a child's story into a haunting. Their job was to find a person, a fault, or a danger they could identify and deal with. They listened to Peggy. They inspected the windows and walls. They too heard the knocking, but couldn't locate its source. Then the female officer stood in the kitchen to take a statement. The children were nearby. Peggy was answering questions. For several minutes, nothing happened. The room began to feel ordinary again. And then the officer noticed the chair beside her. It moved. Her later statement was careful. The chair appeared to wobble, rise slightly, and slide across the floor. She immediately checked it, of course. No wire, no one close enough to push it. no clear cause. But a police officer witnessing something unexplained still didn't mean the police could solve it. There had been no crime, no intruder, no person to arrest. And after recording what they had seen and heard, the officers left. Peggy stood at the front door and watched them go. For a few minutes, official witnesses had filled the house. Now it belonged to the family again. Upstairs, the children's bedroom was still waiting. And morning would not make it someone else's home. By morning, Peggy had a problem that was no longer contained inside the family. A neighbour had heard the knocking. A police officer had reported seeing a chair move. And the story could no longer be dismissed as something Janet had imagined. But it still could not be proved. Peggy wanted help, and the Daily Mirror wanted evidence. Reporter Douglas Bence and photographer Graham Maurice arrived at Green Street hoping to find just that. They entered with cameras ready. The house did nothing. Minutes passed. The children were watched. The rooms remained still. Every quiet second made the family's account appear less convincing. Eventually, the journalists began packing to leave, when a small object crossed the room. Maurice later described marbles and pieces of Lego, moving with enough force that one struck him near the eye. He turned towards the children. Nobody appeared to be in a position to throw it, but his camera had missed the movement. And that became the pattern of Enfield. A witness would hear the beginning of a disturbance and turn to find an object already on the floor. A camera would capture Janet above a bed, but not the moment that placed her there. A tape recorder would record a noise while revealing nothing about the room around it. The case kept producing experiences, but not the kind of evidence that ended an argument. The Mirror published the story, and the Hodgsons gained the help Peggy had asked for, but lost their privacy. Strangers arrived at the gate. Some wanted to witness something. Others wanted to catch the children out lying. Each visitor brought a different expectation into the house. For Janet, belief now came with a condition. She had to make the house perform. Quiet meant disappointment. Noise meant suspicion. The newspaper contacted the Society for Psychical Research, and the case reached Maurice Grosse. Grosse didn't look like a ghost hunter. He was an engineer and inventor who preferred measurements, mechanisms, and written records. He also carried a private reason for taking on this case and wanting hard evidence. Not long before Enfield, his daughter had died in an accident. Her name was Janet. When Maurice entered 284 Green Street, he found another Janet at the center of a family that nobody knew how to help. That connection didn't prove anything about the house, but it helped to explain why he stayed. Maurice began with the ordinary explanations. He marked doors so that movement could be detected. He positioned objects carefully. He brought tape recorders into rooms where the knocks were heard. Witnesses were questioned quickly before they could compare accounts and swap information. Soon, writer and researcher Lyon Playfair joined him. Guy wasn't convinced by everything he saw. He watched the children closely. He challenged incidents that looked suspicious. He spent some time inside the house to separate genuine events from tricks. But observation created a new problem. Because the more equipment they brought in, the more the family became aware of being watched. The more Janet was watched, the more often the disturbances seemed to gather around her. And the more the investigators tried to control the house, the less the house behaved like a controlled place. Knocks interrupted questions. Objects were found when nobody remembered leaving them. Equipment failed at useful moments. Sometimes an entire night passed quietly. Then, just as attention drifted, a crash came from another room. Maurice would reach it seconds later, but the object had already fallen. The child was already frightened, and the cause was already gone. After weeks of this, the most unsettling thing about Green Street was no longer any single incident. It was the feeling that the house understood when nobody was looking. The recordings changed the investigation. A knock could be remembered incorrectly. A chair could be seen from the wrong angle. But a tape could be replayed. So when unfamiliar sounds began to come from Janet's direction, Maurice recorded them whenever he could. At first, they were difficult to describe. A bark, a whistle, a rough voice that seemed too old for the child producing it. Janet's lips barely appeared to move. The sound could continue long enough to leave her throat sore. To Maurice, this made deliberate performance seem unlikely, but not impossible. People can produce voices in unexpected ways. Ventriloquists and vocal specialists later argued that the sound could have been created using structures above the normal vocal cords. That explanation accounted for the voice. It did not explain why Janet was using it, or why the words began to form a person. The voice gave different names at different times, but one name persisted: Bill. Maurice questioned it carefully. Where had Bill lived? What had happened to him? The answers came in fragments, interrupted by insults, jokes, and sudden changes of subject. But one account returned. The voice claimed it had belonged to an old man who had lived in the house and died downstairs after a hemorrhage. At that point, nobody in the room knew whether such a person had even existed. And that uncertainty was important. If Janet already knew the story, the voice could be theatre. But if she didn't, the investigators now had something they could check. They searched the history of the house and found that a former resident named William Wilkins had lived at 284 Green Street. His family later said that he had died in the house, seated downstairs, after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage. The match was not perfect proof. The information could have reached Janet through Neighbours. The questions may have helped shape the answers. Memories become cleaner when people recognize a pattern after the fact. But for Maurice, Bill Wilkins transformed the case. The noises no longer seemed random. The house appeared to have a history. And Janet appeared to be speaking for someone who had lived there before her. That interpretation brought its own danger. Once Bill had a name, every sound could be made to belong to him. A knock was no longer just a knock. A chair was no longer just a chair. The investigators now had a character, and characters make stories easier to believe. Guy remained cautious. He noticed that the voice sometimes followed Janet's habits of speech. It changed subject when questions became difficult. It seemed strongest when attention was concentrated on her. and the investigators began testing Janet as carefully as they tested the house. They asked questions from different rooms. They watched her mouth. They tried to separate her from the places where objects moved. Some results impressed them. Others made them suspicious. Photographs appeared to show Janet rising above her bed. But the camera took still images at intervals. It could capture a child in the air without showing whether she had been lifted or had jumped. To believers, the photographs showed levitation. To critics, they showed a schoolgirl bouncing from a mattress. Both groups were looking at the same frozen second. Neither could see what happened immediately before it, and that was the problem now facing everyone inside Green Street. The case had produced more evidence than almost any haunting of its kind. But every new piece seemed to create two explanations instead of one. And then, the investigators caught Janet cheating. The discovery didn't come as a confession. It came in pieces. A hidden object, a bent spoon, a noise made when Janet believed nobody could see her. On one occasion, Maurice observed her using a broom handle to strike the ceiling. A camera also recorded behavior consistent with deliberate trickery. Eventually, Janet and Margaret admitted that they had staged some incidents. For skeptics, this closed the case. If the girls had cheated once, there was no reason to trust what happened when nobody was watching. That argument was simple and powerful, but it created another problem. Some of the earliest witnesses had arrived before the case became famous. Vic Nottingham described knocks he could not trace. A police officer reported a chair moving. Journalists described objects traveling while they were present. Were all of them mistaken? Had the children deceived each individual witness in a different way? Or had genuine fear and deliberate tricks become mixed together inside the same house? Maurice and Guy chose the third explanation. They accepted that the girls sometimes cheated, especially when the house remained quiet and adults expected something to happen. But they argued that those tricks did not account for everything they had witnessed. Critics saw that as special pleading, accused them of applying double standards. Every exposed incident became fake, while every unexplained incident remained paranormal. The disagreement was no longer about a chest of drawers. It was about trust. And the person carrying most of that argument was still a child. By then, Janet's bedroom was no longer simply where she slept. It was a stage, an observation room, and a test she could never quite pass. If she appeared frightened, people said she was performing. If she laughed, they said she was enjoying the attention. If nothing happened, visitors became impatient. If something did happen, they questioned and disbelieved her. The more people tried to determine whether Janet was telling the truth, the less room she had to behave like an ordinary 11-year-old. This doesn't make the tricks harmless or wrong, but it makes them understandable without making them evidence of a haunting. A child under constant observation may try to control the moment everyone is waiting for. She may try to please people, but once she does, she also gives every doubter a reason to discard the moments she couldn't have controlled. That is why the Enfield case didn't end when the cheating was exposed. It split. One version became a story of a remarkably persistent hoax. Another became a story of unexplained events contaminated by frightened children, publicity, and expectation. Both versions used Janet as their central evidence. neither could fully return her to the child who first called for her mother. The disturbances continued in changing forms for many months. Then they faded. There was no final night when Peggy watched the house become safe again. No single event closed the investigation. People simply spent less time there. The newspapers moved on. The equipment was removed. Janet grew older. The house remained. Years later, she continued to say that while some incidents had been faked, most of what happened was real. Critics continued to argue that the deception made the rest impossible to trust. Neither position can remove the evidence that troubles the other. The skeptical case has real weight. The house was crowded and uncontrolled. The children had opportunity. Janet could produce an unusual voice. The famous photographs can be explained by jumping. Expectation changes what sincere witnesses notice and remember, but the unresolved case also has weight. Reports began before the national attention. Adults outside the family described noises and movement. The police didn't certify a haunting, but one officer did record an event she couldn't explain. None of this proves that 284 Green Street was haunted, and none of it tells us exactly what Janet experienced when the mattress first moved beneath her. So, let's return to the bedroom. Before the reporters, before the tape recorders, and before Bill had a name. Two girls are lying in familiar beds when something makes the room feel unfamiliar. Their mother comes upstairs expecting the usual childish mischief. She checks for ordinary explanations. Then the furniture moves behind her. And from that moment on, every person who entered the house brought a belief with them. Peggy wanted to find a danger she could remove. The police wanted a cause they could identify. Maurice wanted evidence that could survive doubt. The press wanted a story. And Janet wanted someone to believe what she said, even though what she wanted them to believe was just as frightening as the disbelief. Today, the house still looks ordinary. The same path leads through the gate. The number remains beside the door. Upstairs, there is still a bedroom where children once tried to sleep. The room can't tell us whether every knock was real. It can't tell us which moments were tricks. It can only return us to the question Peggy faced when the wood scraped behind her. When the explanation you trust stops fitting what you have just experienced, what do you believe next? If you made it this far, thank you for watching till the end. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd be really grateful if you could like it, and even better if you could subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thanks again, and until next time, take care, and in a bit,